Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Dun& Bradstreet webinar to launch our latest white paper, Business Dynamism in India. Before we begin, just a few things to note. The audience will not have access to speak at any point during the webinar. I would suggest, in case you have any questions, please note them down. And at the end of the webinar, we have a Q&A session where you can post your questions through the Q&A tab on your screen. I will now hand it over to Avinash to take it forward.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. This is Avinash, um, and I'm joined by colleagues of mine, Dr. Arun Singh, and Alok Kambat, who is my colleague and looks after one of our dam operations. Dr. Arun and I have done a few of these, with maybe some of you attended, so it's good to be back. We kind of, like last time, we pulled a new series of thoughts together, and this is hopefully the first of that series of thoughts in terms of presenting what's been happening in the Indian ecosystem around, businesses over the recent past, and some trends and takeaways from that. So hopefully this is interesting. We look forward to having the interaction and your questions. So let me begin. I guess like what we try to do, we try to make it as much fun and dissemination of information as possible. So I'll cover the first bit, and then Dr. Arun will come in, and Alok will come in, and then possibly we'll answer all the questions towards that. So moving rapidly in terms of setting the stage, if I may say so, in terms of what's happening in the ecosystem. I think that all of us have been living the new normal, if I can put it that way, for some time now. And is there a back to the future? Is there a back to normal? I guess no. I think one thing is sure that, given whatever has happened, things have evolved to a point that possibly going back to the old ways of doing stuff is no longer an option for all of us, either in business or in personal life or elsewhere as well. So clearly, the COVID-19 pandemic, apart from all the human tragedy which was caused, and those numbers itself are debatable, is also continues to cause, big economic shocks around the world. All of you are familiar with the numbers in terms of, challenges on GDP growth, and some of the headline numbers in terms of employment, in terms of disposable income and things like that, which my colleagues will also touch upon. But clearly, it's more than that. It's altered, as I said, the very, very essence of how business is conduct commerce, conduct day-to-day activity. We were just chatting among ourselves before we began the call. All three of us obviously are based in Bombay, the speakers. We are all at three different places at home. And our colleague who opened up, Costa, was actually sitting even further up north in a hill station in Himachal with fiber optic cable. And we are kind of doing this conversation with you. So just demonstrates how, I guess, this would have not been possible maybe 14, 15 months ago, but how things have pulled together. So I think in many sectors, relevant to us, it's going to be not an option of back to normal. We'll have to be rethinking right through. And I think this is one of those moments possibly in human civilization that, it is going to lead to a lot of new ideas. I guess out of periods like this, really new ideas, new thoughts, new businesses emerge, which hopefully will lead to the next phase of growth. So clearly, we'll all have to learn how to swim. If you're not already swimming, maybe that's a challenge, but clearly one will learn how to swim very rapidly and make changes as we go through. But broadly, four factors which possibly might shape the next normal for businesses. One clearly is reduced income levels. I think I read somewhere that, in India itself, over the last 12 months or so, something like US dollars 10 billion had been spent by people on COVID-related healthcare expenses. Now, clearly, if COVID wasn't there and these $10 billion were available, they could be spent on many other useful things rather than emergency healthcare, which people have spent money on. And maybe that number is understated. And if you look at it globally, you can just imagine what this is doing in terms of healthcare spend in some of the larger countries. So clearly, most people will have a reduced income level. Globally, per capita income levels have regressed by possibly up to 5 years. So that's clearly going to have an impact on the consumption story, and I guess governments are very keen to keep that going. And clearly, from an India point of view, as you know, consumption really is driving the economy and the growth of the economy. Second, obviously, is the rise in uncertainty. And levels of uncertainty, according to various studies, are 4 times what they were in the earlier SARS pandemic epidemic. So clearly, levels of uncertainty around how do you do business, what do you do with your various stakeholders, only lead to a lot more disruption in terms of doing business. Social distancing, and I think we are all aware of how that's impacted everyday activity, everyday work life, everyday personal life. And I guess this is going to roll through in terms of various variants, and till this knocked together, lots of businesses will clearly see an impact in terms of whenever infection levels rise, what happens. As you know, all in Bombay, they're looking to open up the public transport, basically the backbone of the city, which is the local trains. And we'll have to see what kind of impact does that have in terms of spread and infection going forward. And obviously, the last one is the resilience gap. The average lead time to source, for example, raw materials or inputs have doubled following the break of the pandemic. For example, most of you will have followed what's happening in the auto car industry and the broader chip industry, the shortage effectively of semiconductors, leading to a very funny situation where used car prices have increased so much in most of the large markets, be it the US, even the UK, just because its car production itself is going to be a lot slower, possibly, as some of the Volkswagen group companies have said, possibly for the next 12 to 18 months. So I think those are some of the big challenges. I don't know if you move to the next slide. And then looking at some of the more radical shifts in terms of what's going to happen in the impact to business tomorrow. The 4 things I'd like to stress on in terms of some of the things which all of us are getting and observing and seeing. One, obviously, is the increase in adoption of digital technology. We touched upon this in some of the papers we did very specifically for the SME sector as well. Very rapid adoption of digital technology across the sector. And I guess, this possibly has taken what would have taken in a normal course of time, a decade or so, that acceleration has been that quick. And I guess this will continue, and that one can see in the stock market performance of many of the companies in the sector, and how more increasingly as well, how governments are reacting to that market power. And if I could use the word monopoly power in some of the spaces in terms of constraining that. But that's not going to impact the adoption of the digital technology itself. That, I think, is just a one-way highway for now, if I can put it that way, and that will continue to happen. The other thing, obviously, is that, as we touched upon in the previous slide, the consumers of tomorrow are not going to behave or be the same consumers as they were before the pandemic. I touched upon the reduced income levels, the social distancing measures. I mean, these are going to alternate consumer behavior in a large way, possibly in some of the countries where there is no social net, or even in the countries where there is a social net, the Western countries where people had furloughs, people have had effectively money and salaries being paid to them without working, and have had some savings. I would imagine that the consumer behavior first would be, given the impact of this pandemic, to save some of that money rather than spend it on consumption. So I think consumer behavior might get impacted till a new normal arises, or human memories are always short. But I think there will be definitely a change in terms of how consumers will behave going forward from next year. Revenge travel is some of the things that people have talked about. One will have to see what trends emerge from that. And the third thing, which obviously we spend a lot of time on in Dun & Bradstreet, in the supply chain. I mean, clearly that will get more decentralized. Among our own client base, we are seeing both locally, internationally, clients are looking for alternate suppliers because they've had issues with their current suppliers in terms of reliability, in terms of delays. I think people want to de-risk, and they're very keen, given what's happening because of the pandemic, given what's happening because of the increasing geopolitics, also possibly fueled by the pandemic. How can I get a better set of safer, more reliable suppliers besides the one I currently have? The trend on nearshoring, we talked about the semiconductor bit. The US has said, they would like to manufacture more semiconductors in the US. This morning, or I think late yesterday, there was a press article about the Tata Group saying that they might want to manufacture semiconductors in India. I think, I mean, these things don't take, these things take a lot of time. They take a lot of capital. They take a lot of commitment. So these things are not said in haste. And, clearly one can see the assuring of some of the very important things gathering momentum. And fourth will be the increased focus on reliance, in terms of making sure in the client vendor relationship that there is more certainty. I mean, just-in-time inventory, just-in-time production models, which have become very popular, may lose. I know they became popular in a different age and time as well. I was reading an interview by the CEO of Msmes, who said, that just-in-time inventory was very popular when interest rates were very high. Companies were not happy to carry large inventory, but now when interest rates are so low, companies don't mind carrying that much inventory because it doesn't build in that much cost. But interest rates will go up one day, and carrying inventory will become more expensive. But possibly companies will not really would like to plan a lot more. And given some of the other things we've seen, like the Suez Canal disaster earlier this year, I think people would like to have a much more better disaster recovery framework, and would like to have a lot more in terms of backup and reliance on the entire ecosystem, something which we spend a lot of time on. Moving to the next slide in terms of talking about some of the relevant sectors, and obviously some categories of businesses which are flourishing today. Not all of them possibly will continue to flourish once the world returns to normal, which it will. I mean, one can always debate that. I guess more and more people will still use it, but will e-education, will telemedicine remains as relevant as it is at the peak of the pandemic, or once the pandemic ends? One would imagine that in a country like India, which is a very high-touch country, a high relationship country, one would see possibly some kind of easing off in terms of using some of these modes for fulfilling daily needs and daily demands. But some categories will continue to see accelerated growth. We talked about a lot of the digital transformation, digital payments, for example, things which possibly would have taken a lot, as I said, maybe a decade to get up to speed. I think that journey is a one-way journey. But the ease of making that happen is just too easy, and those are not very high touch or high relationship businesses in many ways. But some of the businesses, for example, which are personal services, recreation, travel, are struggling. Given, however, the infections and the pandemic rules plays out, with density and crowds will remain an issue. Many businesses will have to rethink their business models. The hotel, tourism, service industry, for example, will have to devise something so that if there is ever a crisis again, it doesn't lead to a complete shutdown of that sector, which, for example, right across the world in many parts has happened. Tourism, as you know, is the largest employer of people globally. It has a huge cascading effect on what's happening, and what's happening currently in most of the Western governments in terms of opening up for the summer, I guess, is led by trying to get tourism as a pressure valve, not only for people, but to get the economies going. So I think the next time around, governments, people in position of power will be very, I think, we really have to think through that, how can this not happen for long periods of time? Because I don't think there's another opportunity for people governments to put people on furlough, people to compensate people over such a large period of time. Moving to my last slide in terms of, before I hand over to Arun, in terms of, what should leaders do for your businesses to remain competitive? And clearly, as we all know that, when you can't grow the top line, when you're really struggling to basically survive and grow in the competitive world, what you can definitely do is to reduce cost. And that is something all of us are already doing. We're not only reducing costs right across the platform in terms of trying to make ourselves more efficient, we're trying to use our real estate platform well, we're trying to use our information platforms well, we're trying to use information better in terms of accessing new clients. As I mentioned, using information better in terms of accessing new suppliers. And businesses will try to be a lot more cost effective. The second thing, obviously, is to manage the risk. Arun and Alok will touch upon a lot of the businesses which get set up don't survive the entire long life cycle of business setup, business growth, and clearly you don't want to be in bed with partners who either have high levels of financial risk or high levels of operational risk. You want to quantify that, you want to red flag that, you want to minimize disruption. And that's what we've seen in our own information setup, in the Dun & Bradstreet setup, that over the last 12, 14 months, we've seen an increasing amount of uncertainty, as I mentioned, that people are accessing a lot more information on each other. People are concerned about checking on their vendors. Will those people be able to deliver on time? People are checking on people they contract with, that will I get paid on time? And this is not only for small players or mid-sized players, this is for large players. Everybody's checking on everybody. The financiers are checking on everybody. Corporate clients are checking on everybody. So clearly managing risk, using information better, using our products possibly better, will possibly help you in doing that. And obviously due diligence, again, we talked about people getting alternate suppliers, onboarding a new supplier, a new customer, third party. In today's complex world, and complex large company world sometimes can take a very long period of time. And clearly, you need to set up processes, you need to have systems, you need to have products in place where this can be done in a much faster time frame and with an absolutely sure outcome, which allows you to take a decision to move forward or not. And clearly, in large companies like ourselves and many of yours, this needs to be done in a very auditable, accurate way, which allows this process to be done well. So again, accelerating that process and speed to market can only help in terms of getting a business to be remaining more competitive. And maybe a last motherhood statement from me in terms of protecting reputation and brand. I think all of us know that, again, in this very complex investor-driven ESG world, and ESG is not only a term really for for large companies. ESG is also a term for the whole SMB, SME network as well. Protecting that brand, protecting their reputation is very key. You don't want to have any stakeholders who will tarnish your brand. Lots of studies on how all kinds of networks, all kinds of shell companies, shell jurisdictions can really, and we're seeing that in India play out as well, help really ruin your reputation and ruin your brand value, which decreases not only shareholder value, but just makes the entire stakeholder universe a lot more difficult to handle. So partnering with companies who have the right reputation, right financial strength is the key. And getting the right information, getting the right kind of background checks, the KYCs, AMLs, onboarding done can only help. So which is something which we spend a lot of time trying to assist our clients do, and we'd be happy to touch upon that in the Q&A. So let me hand over to Dr. Arun Singh for now, and then come back towards the end, and we can all answer the questions. Dr. Arun.
Thank you, Avinash, for such a wonderful insight. That was really great. And now I'll switch to give some perspective about some of those findings of the white paper, what we have done. And basically, this white paper is timely in the sense this is a very critical environment, and you don't need me to say that this is one of the biggest crisis of a human crisis of the century after Spanish flu almost a century back. In that scenario, there's still a hope. There's a development happening at a business level, at a company level, and that's always critical and important to highlight those elements. So I'll move on and talk about some of our finding, what we basically found in our white paper that will give some perspective about the development of the companies, especially the new business registration in India. So this is one of the first slide. I'm going to cover up broadly three broad areas. One, the overall business dynamism, overall business registration framework, and which sectors have done. I mean to say, where the sector's registration is higher and where sector registration is not that great. Avinash had touched base from a 2x2 metrics perspective, and he was talking about those sector element that not all the sector is going to grow in the same manner. There will be a different route most of the sector will take. That route will depend on what is the future looking like for them, what is the consumer demand looking like for them, and what is overall development happening post-pandemic era. And then third things basically I would talk about, not that's everything is rosy picture. There is something we need to be careful in terms of business, business exit, and before we start doing the trade. So the 3 to 4 section I'm going to cover up in our in my slide today. First, if I have to start about the business dynamism, and if I have to talk about what are the measure for the business dynamism, that's basically a rate at which business enter in a market and the rate at which existing one exit the market. It is basically a market economy to have healthy levels of business dynamism. New business entries translate into the higher level of competition in a market, and thereby that force existing ones to be more productive or risk. The new businesses are coming in with some change in entire business framework. In that scenario, consumer benefit to basically consumer benefit. Non-price results in higher marginal utility per product or the services we talk about. These factors, in fact, in turn, create or generate new employment opportunity and the productivity and then economic growth, which means coming up, the new businesses coming in, old businesses cannot be productive or efficient, exiting is good for the economy, good for the employment generation, good for the productivity. That's how basically it work around it. Now, I was talking about COVID-19 pandemic. It's a big human tragedy. It's not just big human tragedy, it's also a very big economic shocks. What is the recent economic shocks we still remember is the economic crisis of 2008 financial crisis. But this is like say once in a century. In fact, we have not seen any of such crisis where each and every country got impacted. And as a result, most of us might have assumed that this business activity would have subsided or going down or is not going to basically pick up. Against that understanding, against that notion, the number of business registration in last year, FY 2021, in India was a record high. That's basically things we need to be basically talking about, and that's the thing is very critical and eye-opening. The birth rate of new business, what we call, the new registration basically, that's the way we measure is the number of new businesses registered as a percentage of active firms, which is showing on this chart, grew at a healthy rate of 10.2% last year and 11.6% this year. That's basically one of the biggest increase we have seen. You can see historically we never had such a wonderful growth. Now moving on to a sectoral level, what we have, something around 200,000 businesses got registered in FY21 as compared to just 160,000 businesses in last year. Their growth is around something around 24%. In terms of incremental growth, if I have to talk about, manufacturing sector that you can see on the chart is on the top. The sector have witnessed something around 40,000 registration in this year compared to just 26,000 last year. That's around 13,000 growth. Maybe if I have to put into the growth rate number perspective, the 50% growth we have seen in the manufacturing sector. Services sector, I mean, that also seen the register what you call one of the great growth, something around 14%. Agriculture sector, if you have to see, that's a great growth. I mean, if you ask economists generally put sectors into the three broad categories: manufacturing, that's basically industry, the services, and agriculture. Look at the agriculture growth. Not surprising, because there are many factors which I'll touch base why that's growing. Is more than 100% growth we have seen in terms of the new business registration during FY21. That's one of the what I would say a great achievement from agriculture sector perspective, and the inclusive growth what we're talking about from an economist perspective. Now, what we have done, we basically have taken two metrics. We have taken a metrics what you call share of new business registration during last year, and the growth of new business registration this year over the last year, and divided entire metrics into 4x4, 2x2 metrics. There's a 4-quadrant coming in. The top right, if you have to see, that's the star sector. That's basically sector who had a high share of new business last year, as well as had very high growth rate. And then we have what we call bottom right sector, where high growth rate in terms of, high share in last year, but low growth rate, what we call rising sectors. Then there are bottom left, what we call struggling sectors, low share as well as low growth, whereas bottom top, what we call rising sectors. For example, I'm saying the bottom top is rising sectors where the growth is high, whereas share is less. The two component, if you talk about star sectors and the rising sectors, here, what basically Avinash was talking about, these are the sectors, what we can call it the pandemic induced or pandemic forced sectors, where they got maximum benefit. And some of the sectors are likely to stay. For example, star sectors, they're not just growing now. In fact, they were growing earlier. Just the pandemic have accelerated the growth for them, and that's going to stay here. Now let me talk about each quadrant in detail. What basically star sectors look like. As I said, star sector is a high share, high growth. Those sectors are agriculture production. That's a crop, no doubt about that. Food and type of product, manufacturing, wholesale of non-durable goods, chemical manufacturing, social services, educational services, computer related services. All these sectors, the growth, there's a proper reasoning behind that one. If you have to talk about agriculture and food manufacturing sectors, that's reasonable. Why I'm talking about that during the pandemic, consumers restricted their expenditure to the most of the basic or necessary item, and they cut down their expenditure from the non-discretionary spending toward the, when the economic downturn start. And that's where you have seen the agriculture and the food manufacturing sector prospering. In fact, monsoon also added to the benefit of the agriculture sector last 2 years. That's one thing. Now, chemical manufacturing, no doubt about that. Social services, hospitals, nursing, homes, trusts, all these are justified sector because we have seen these sectors flourish during 2020 and 2021 so far, and likely to continue in a new world. Now, if you talk about educational services, I think people started working from home. Most of us are want to have a reskill or maybe want to have a better skill and utilize those travel time and things like that. And there, your educational services have basically cropped up, during this one. And the computer related services, no doubt, not surprising element because we have seen, as Avinash was mentioning about, we all of based out of Mumbai, but today we are connected from 4 different locations. One is extreme north, and that's you can say that this possible because of this pandemic. And then these sector have taken a maximum growth. Now talking about top left sector, that's the rising sectors. Those sectors, if you look at, that's retail stores, the food retailers, agriculture services, including livestock production, management consulting services, testing laboratories, and biological research services. Everything is justified here. I've spoken about economic downturn. In economic downturn, consumer restrict their expenditure, and there's basically food retailers is coming, upfront. 2021 was a global disruption, no doubt about that. And you can see there's a management consulting services was a heightened demand for most of the company, and that's what one can see it's coming up. And there are testing laboratories, no doubt, research, and then what you call thrust for having a what you call more and more information about the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic and the next health lifestyle for next 5 year, 10 year, all provided a support to the testing laboratories and the biological research services. And that you can see not great sectors from a share perspective, but they have seen significant growth during last 2 years. And that's why we are calling them a rising sectors. Now moving into the bottom right sector, they are large shareholder in the sector spectrum, but not growing much. We understand, they are because of, social distancing, because of lockdown measures got impacted in terms of the personal services, real estate, for example, some of the communication sectors got impacted and going to be remain impacted at least for some more quarter going forward. Now that brings to the last sector. That's what we call a struggling sector. No share so far, or maybe very, very small share, no growth at all. And that's basically one has to be very careful in terms of, talking about where the health of these businesses in terms of establishing some sort of red flag. There are more my colleague Alok is going to talk about. It's not about good news. It's also about how frequently we are monitoring the bad news so as we can protect our balance sheet, not going into that trap. Those are sectors: consumer durable, transportation services, repair services, restaurants and bars. Some of those will recover, but some of them will have a permanent damage and might take years to come back to the normal or will impact other sector as well. Now, there's another trend which we have monitored, and there's a reasoning behind that. Because if you see the supply chain decentralization, what Avinash was talking about, that's happening at the global level. That's for sure. There's many events the pandemic has triggered. In fact, US-China trade war before the pandemic have created those shift in the global manufacturing space and the company, and the pandemic have just accelerated. India is going to benefit. In fact, India is trying to take a benefit of that, not just from an international movement perspective, also from a domestic movement perspective. We have seen, and that's coming out. Today, if you look at before pandemic, most of the concentration of a new company comes in the city, the cluster, where top 10 cities, let's say Mumbai, New Delhi, Bangalore, Chennai, we have seen more and more company coming in that. But now, given the supply chain issues, concerns around that, the customers are setting their plant and company where their customers are based out of that. And that's precisely the point. They are going into the smaller cities, towns where most of their customers are based located. So as they are not basically going to face the supply chain or lockdown issues or anything, because they are trying to prepare for the next cycle of what we call the wave of concern, not just COVID-19, could be anything, because that's learning for everyone. And uh, I have seen semiconductor, what Avinash was talking about, how the company are really facing the challenge from the semiconductor perspective, and I think all of you are aware of. And company taking a dedicated and conscious call to decentralize that, because that's depending on one location is going to be painful. And that's what is coming out. It's not just top 10 cities in India. It's basically spreading to the outside cities to give a well diversified reach. Now, having said that, there's a concern, what basically I was trying to talk about, that not everything is a rosy picture. The next slide will talk about more detail. But thing is that there are exit rate. Something around 13,000 businesses in FY21 exited, and 75,000 exited in last year, 2020, in fact. These numbers could be small or large. We should not be basically looking at from a, what you call, very serious perspective, because these data are just for 2 years. Because what we have done in terms of research in last 1 decade, it takes a time. It takes basically a few years for a company to set up their unit and then wind up, because that depend on the economic cycle. Because economic cycle in India, if I have to look at this 2 type of cycle, one we have a short term, one we have a long term. The short term is always a 5-year. So all this company who are basically vulnerable to economic shock, they basically wind up their business in just 5 years. All the economy who can maintain some of the economic shocks and cannot tolerate the bigger shock, they wind up their business in the 10 years. That's because in India, we have 2 shocks, 5-year and the 10-year shock. That's reflecting in our data point as well. And if you look at this one, 200,000 company we have looked at last 10 years. And unfortunately, one company out of 2 went out of business in just 4 years. That's what's basically coming in. Why? Because these businesses are very small in nature. The paid up capital was just 1 million, and their maximum survival rate was just 6 years, or on an average of 12-year data when we looked at. For example, 10-year data when we looked at these companies, more than 80% of the businesses are out of business today. And that's what basically we were trying to talk about, and that's what Avinash in the last slide touch base, and my colleague Alok will explain more. It's not about understanding those rosy picture that 103% growth in the agriculture sector, more than 50% growth in manufacturing sector, 14% growth in services sector. That's all the good picture. But the need of the hour, we should also monitor or keep monitoring the how many companies are going out of the business, and what is the success rate look like, and what is the look like of these companies, that what is the survival rate basically, that I will not be impacted from a supply side perspective or from a client side perspective in terms of the payment or red flag or compliance issues, all those elements. So with that, I will close my PPT. I will pass this to my colleague Alok for talking about some of those red flags, some of those area where DNB can basically help protect businesses to keep things under control. Thank you. Alok.
You're on mute. Yeah, now you're okay.
Hey, thanks, Arun, for covering the main thrust from the white paper. And thanks, Avinash, for sharing your thoughts around the next norm for the business. I'm pleased to be, there over here for the release of this white paper. I have about 10 to 15 minutes and will try to provide some insight as to how DNB tracks these businesses and thereby how our solutions are framed to meet the requirements on different use cases, be it on the sales, risk, compliance, and the finance use cases. Our global data strategy and management approach starts wherever possible with a very robust foundation of official public records, essentially the official public registry, which captures the legal entity, and there we assign our proprietary unique identifier, which is the DUNS number. Thereafter, we build onto our data assets through proprietary information that we contribute, combine it with the public data sources, which are both structured or unstructured in nature. In addition to that, we also monitor the activity and the signal insights to measure the digital footprint of the businesses. All these are done within the ambit of our data governance and quality control. I'm going to move to the next slide. The next slide essentially talks about the 6 phases in the life cycle of the business. And each phase is very, very important within the life cycle of the business entity. It starts from covering the entities at the earliest point of establishment, and we fingerprint them with a unique identifier, which I mentioned about the DUNS number, all the way through ultimately to the closure of the business. Just on a lighter note, if you observe the way the business cycle is, it pretty much mirrors the professional life cycle. We join a company, that's the start of our career. We grow within our career. We reach a stage where we mature in the organization. All of a sudden, there is a midlife crisis. We start thinking, what's the purpose of life? What we are doing? How do we upskill ourselves? How do we upskill ourselves? And then we go about in terms of readjusting our strategy to the new norm, and then move to the next level of our growth before we decide to hang our boots. Now, coming to how this can be related to the business life cycle, capturing data and insight at all phases of the business life cycle is even critical more than ever now, and the pandemic has actually been a testimony around it. It is very important for each of our customers to understand at which phase the companies whom they are engaging with are at. So let's talk about the first phase, which is the startup phase. When we talk about the startup phase, our key aspect is focus, especially in terms of detecting entities which are in existence. And when we talk about these new businesses, there is very, very limited information which is available on those entities. Either those are business registries that we get information for, or these guys would have come up with certain website or portals where the information could be made available. What DNB does is that over and above these information that we have access to, we tag the digital footprint of the company. We also try to understand who the key management promoters are, who are the owners behind the business, and try to match the pedigree onto these businesses and give a flavor in terms of what this particular startup is all about. The next phase, which is the growth phase, is quite a unique phase. And one of the reasons being that it might take months or at times years for the companies to be operationally active. As Arun talked about, almost 1 in every 2 businesses actually shut down within 4 years. And that's the reason we track the growth phase very, very closely to understand whether the businesses are active by the time the next filing requirements come in place. Signs of these operational activity on such entities support multiple use cases wherein customers come to us from a compliance standpoint, onboarding, KYC, AML. We have bankers who work with us on the lending side, as well as the utility companies who work with us and try to understand the information on businesses. The next phase, there's the maturity phase. And from a database point, this is one of the most difficult phase. And the reason is that we face a very significant challenge as there is plethora of data or information which you start getting at the phase when the company is at a maturity phase. We get information on the customers they engage with. We get to know about which suppliers they engage with. We get information on the compliances. We get information on the financial stability, so on and so forth. Multiple such information are available, and we need to make sure that we are able to provide a very holistic view on these businesses. And that's where our dunce number as well as identity resolution plays a very, very important and a critical role, which helps us in terms of connecting the dots and providing a data and insight on these businesses. The next phase is the most critical stage in the business life cycle. Remember, the data management is not static. Data keeps on changing constantly, and we constantly access millions of data points, capture, process, and monitor these data points on business entities. As a part of this particular phase, the most important and crucial aspect is to identify and looking in for certain parameters, which are indicators in the decline of a business, which could be in the form of derogatory legal events. It could be in the form of decline in terms of employment within the organization, how the payment behavior of the company is, whether they are making timely payments to their vendors on time or not. And there are multiple other alternative data sources that we try and ascertain through the digital footprint of the company. And then comes the midlife crisis, which you call it as a reinvigoration phase. Companies reinvent themselves in this particular phase in the form of either change in management, it could be infusion of fresh capital. They try to understand the landscape and then accordingly strategize themselves once, and then they start showing the signs of growth. Finally, is in the business closure phase. Though not all businesses shut down with a bang, they just fade away. And this is very, very critical. And especially when we see these small and medium businesses, they just fade away. It could be reason because the owner doesn't want to wish to continue with the business. They have retired, probably no succession planning in place, or probably the business is actually not doing well. And that's the reason we actually track various physical aspects about the company as well as the digital heartbeat of these companies. And by using our machine learning capabilities, we try to see if there are any kind of irregular activity which happens on these businesses. And ultimately, when there is no further signs of those businesses, we track them as out of business. Move to the next slide. We capture the life cycle of these businesses on 45.5 crore entities. 45.5 crores is the largest database that Dun & Bradstreet has today globally, which is the largest on planet. We expect to be about 45 crores by the end of this year. And if you typically observe, India stands out as the top 3 markets where the focus is in terms of improving the coverage, especially on the SMB side, as well as the focus is in terms of covering the depth of the information as well. When we talk about these 45 crore businesses, the segment starts not only from small enterprises, but it goes all the way to huge corporates and everything in between. And the idea is to cover every aspect of the company through the digital footprint as well as the physical footprint of the entity. And these are then used further by our customers either to analyze sales or try to understand the supply chain or also try to understand the complex customer relationship. To the next one. Yeah, this is quite interesting, guys. This slide is essentially talking about, Arun touched upon a particular point in terms of insights of new businesses which are covered in the database. There are new businesses which are getting registered day in, day out. But what's very, very interesting for us to understand is, are these information really important or critical for our customers domestically or globally? This is the insight which is proprietary to DNB, which we have been able to analyze from our database. There are about 1,800 customers who have actually done checks on these new businesses which have got registered in the last 3 years. There are 1.84 lakh checks which have happened on these businesses, which means on a daily basis, there are 200 checks which are happening on new businesses. What's even more interesting is that if you see on this slide, you see the top 20 countries which are actually quite interested when they are trying to track these new businesses. It starts from US, Canada, you have got UK, you have got Nordic regions, Scandinavian region, European nation, we have got Middle East, all the way to APAC region, which means that all the countries across the globe, as well as in India, are pretty focused in terms of trying to do and track the businesses right from the start when they have actually got incorporated. When we talk about sectors of interest, we analyzed it further. Which are the sectors which are of prominence or of interest to our customers? And we break it into two. When we talk about service industry, the computer related services, the engineering services, management services, educational services, and social services have been of critical importance to our customers. Social services probably because of the pandemic, there have been renewed interest in those sectors which have been there. And when we see what Arun talked about in one of the slides, which are the ones in terms of high growth sectors, these sectors literally mimic the high growth as well as the businesses of importance to our customer. When we come on to the manufacturing sectors, food tops the chart, followed by chemicals, pharmaceutical sectors. Then we have got the electronic and electronic products, which are frequently inquired. And finally, the textile segment, which is of importance to our customers. Over the last year and a half, what we started doing is we started to understand and ascertain what are the reasons why the customers are looking in for these new businesses. What's the use case around these? We spoke to a few high-tech players, why they leverage onto our database. The key aspect is to identify new prospect, and the objective is to expand their footprint in specific sectors which they have identified. What we have also noticed is that they have come up with solutions which are specifically focused around SMEs and startups. And the idea is to actually catch them young and be a part of their ecosystem, at the initial stage itself, so that when it's in the growth phase or when there's a maturity phase, they are completely embedded into their CRMs or their systems. We spoke to a lot of BFSI segments, in the banking, financial segments, how they leverage our customer, how we leverage our data. And these are essentially solutions at the time of onboarding for their KYC requirements. And interestingly, they also want to understand if there are any digital footprint or relationships of the case management personals or any kind of a pedigree of information which could be available on them. Lastly, I want to cover a very, very interesting use case, and this happened during the pandemic. And this was a lot of e-commerce players. And during the pandemic, we saw that a lot of brick and mortar businesses, the sales moved from an offline mode to an online mode. One of the challenges which these e-com players faced was that there were a plethora of requests which they started getting for suppliers or merchants to actually get onboarded onto their platform, because everybody wanted to move on to the digital mode and start making or generating sales. The challenge for these e-com players was they had a very traditional way of onboarding the suppliers and the merchant bankers. They used to take weeks to actually onboard them. And this pandemic actually increased the volumes to handle, because of which the SLAs were actually getting delayed further. As a solution, we were able to provide them with some API related solutions wherein they were able to do KYC checks, getting background checks of information, where the businesses are actually standing at this point in time, any history about the company or the promoters. And we were able to not only reduce the backlog, but more importantly, their SLA reduced significantly. In fact, it improved from the pre-pandemic levels by almost 60%. So that's the level of intensity and the importance of all these new businesses have, in the ecosystem. We move on to the next slide. The next slide essentially covers about various steps which goes about in terms of collecting our information all the way to the distribution of information. Just to add, when we talk about our collection of information, there are 100+ sources that we tag and build our information on. It starts from the business registry information to the filing information around indirect taxation. It goes for compliance checks, negative news, so on and so forth. Plethora of information that we actually access. The key is how do we go about in terms of organizing and standardizing these data assets which are there. And that's a lot of heavy lifting which is required there. And that's where our DUNS number assignment takes a very, very critical and important role. Because once a DUNS gets attached to a particular entity at a location level, we then start tracking all the information pertaining to that entity, and anything related to it, be it the positive or the negative information, is then attached to that particular DUNS record. One particular aspect when we talk about collection and organizing is we are very, very careful in terms of choosing what kind of data sources that we are actually acquiring. We don't acquire data sources wherein it's not sustainable, which means that if I get the data only for once in a lifetime, we just get rid of the data source. We don't acquire information from that source. The idea is that the next phase, once we are able to collect and organize, is to manage and maintaining the data assets which are there. And that's the reason if the sustainable data sources are there, we are then able to maintain and manage the information more effectively with higher level of frequency so that the customers are able to get the most accurate and the latest updated information at the time of decision making, which is there. Once all these three attributes are in place, we come up with derived attributes, which are generally the traditional attributes, or we come up with new attributes which are there. And one other solution that we have is wherein we have our customer data married with the DNB data within the Analytics Studio environment, which is like a sandbox environment, and then come up with certain predictive indicators, delinquency scores, customized credit limits, so on and so forth. And then these are published within multiple products of ours. Once they get published in our products, there are multiple channels through how we distribute to our customers. One is in the form of APIs, which is in the form of Direct Plus and data blocks, which meets the use cases on the sales and marketing, as well as on the credit, as well as on the risk side of the business. We are currently seeing increased adoption of these API solutions because the customer now needs information at a click of a button within their CRMs. And this pandemic has been an eye-opener for them. A lot of businesses were trying to make changes to the shift in terms of automation, but this pandemic has actually fast-tracked that particular way of accessing and consuming the data which is there. The other products that we have is in the form of user interface. These are essentially products where you can do it by yourself. Our solutions around Hoovers and DNB iAccess primarily centered around the sales and the marketing solution. We have got solution, our flagship product DNB Credit, which is now financial analytics, where our solutions center around the on the credit and the risk side of the business. And then we have got DNB Onboard to meet the compliance need of our customers. Finally, there still are certain customers who have their own internal CRMs or ERPs that have been developed for which the customers are looking in for data in a batch mode. So we even provide data in the form of a batch. Go to the next slide, Arun. The final slide covers about how we help the companies grow and thrive in 5 different ways. First, talked about the coverage. We have got the largest database, especially on the B2B side on this planet. We have about 42.8 crore businesses. We have got 37 crore global contacts. And one interesting aspect that we have in our database is linkages. We have got 3.7 crore businesses where we have got linkage information. And these are essentially used to identify the ultimate beneficial owners. Who the ultimate beneficial owners of the company are, to get to know that where eventually the money is landing or who the ultimate owner of a particular entity is, because there are many cause relationships which we have identified within our database. The second thing around quality, very proud to say that we have a very robust matching engine, the best in class today that we have in the world. We have got 124 patents which have been issued. And why is this critical? Why is this matching capability very critical? As I talked about in my prior slides, by virtue of multiple data sources that we aggregate, it's very important and critical that the information of a particular entity is matched to the correct information or the correct company which is there. And that's where our matching tool plays a very, very important and a critical role. From a completeness standpoint, we have about 2,500 attributes that we come up with. Plus, there are various derived attributes, which is proprietary to us. And when we talk about the depth of these information on the attributes, this cut across segments, be it on the sales side, marketing side, finance, as well as compliance. So it meets all the needs of our customers. Whatever we do today in terms of building the information is basis the feedback that we got from the customers, plus the emerging trends that we actually track. One of the emerging trends that we are tracking is essentially around just not these traditional data sources or information, but we're also trying to see a huge strategy that we're trying to build on the alternate data that we are building, and that you will hear more as we move progress in that particular direction. Finally, talk about the next part of how we help our companies grow and thrive is essentially around the fact that we want all our customers, when they are actually using our data, to be very confident when they use our data. So we are very, this about the fact that we try to meet all the global privacy program, which ensures the compliance needs from a privacy standpoint, be it in terms of the SPI, or the PI information that we capture. So we are compliant with our CCPA, the GDPR rules, the SOC2, and as you know, China is coming out with its new laws later in the year, which is the China's data protection rules, which are primarily centered around the GDPR rules. When we talk about for India, we have got the India's personal data protection bill, which have been doing the rounds for the last couple of years. We keep a very close track on all these regulations to try to make sure that we are compliant with these regulations, so the customers are very confident when they actually use our content. And lastly, and not the least, is the expertise that we have. We have a very passionate team of quantitative analysts. We've got PhDs. Dr. Arun is a PhD in the team. We've got data advisors, and they are always in lookout for new data sources, trying to keep our data refreshed and updated at all point in time, so that the customers are able to take an informed decisions and able to track the life cycle of the company. So this is how we go about in terms of tracking our businesses and have developed our solutions around it on all the verticals, be it on the sales, risk, compliance, and the finance side. This is what I wanted to cover. Thank you so much. I open this up for questions which people may ask. Thank you.
I think Arun's holding the pen on that. Arun, depending on time, you can take that.
So thank you all for that.
Yes, we are now open for questions, so you can use the question answer tab on your screen to post any questions that you may have, and we will try to answer as many as possible.
Yeah, so there's one question, Avinash, one coming in. How do we manage dynamic complexity? Example, some event which impact with a lag after a few days. I mean, of course, we know we have seen the Suez Canal issues. Suez Canal was just 7 days, or maybe less than 7 days impact, but basically the pileup was so much that impacted. So how, from a day lag perspective, how that impact? So that's they basically want to understand.
How do we manage our data, or what is the question? How do we,
this complexity, basically.
How do we manage our business?
Yeah.
I think maybe the question is covering many aspects. I don't know. So just how do we manage our data? Obviously, as Alok mentioned, the aim is to update our data as quickly and as frequently as possible, and that's what we try to do. I think one of the things we also doing a lot more now is around global shipping data. Talking of specifically the example, if the question mentioned or just Arun mentioned the example. So we have our shipping data is quite extensive and quite unique in terms of not only shipping movements but also in terms of ownerships, and Alok mentioned video in terms of ownership of these assets. So the aim is to try to get as frequent updates and as recent updates as possible on all elements of data which might be relevant to our clients, be it events of that nature, be it financial events, bankruptcies, for example, or filing of bankruptcies, or issues where people start defaulting on various payments, and those then impact our various scores. So the aim is to be as up to date and as quick as possible, and for which we use our own sources, and we have various partnerships around the world to do that as well.
Thank you, Avinash. There's one related question also coming in for you. One, basically, this is a new business framework, and there's new business coming in. There may not be a substantial credit history, of course, because they are new business, they just set up and there's absolutely nothing. In that case, how do we monitor the health of these businesses? Are there any early signs of business failures to look out for? Basically, there's nothing in the history. What element, how DNB can help to understand, and what are the signs we can look at these businesses are healthy or not?
Sure. So I think Alok referenced some parts of it in his comments. So obviously, from a static point of view, in terms of strength of business, credibility of business, there are various things you can look at. Strength of shareholders, strength of stakeholders, prior history of performance, and things of that kind. From a static point of view. But Alok in his comments referenced, dynamic data and analysis of the same. So today, it's possible in today's business environment, in today's reporting and corporate reporting world, governance reporting world, to get a lot of data, which with the consent of these small businesses can be accessed, can analyzed, and you can get, pretty much a very good idea of what's happening in the business on a fairly dynamic basis. So which is what Alok mentioned is a capability which across the world, the Dun & Bradstreet is building out. And we are able to do that. So we have systems and procedures in place to, with consent, to analyze this, access and analyze this data and give you very good signals, very good early warning signals, very good monitoring methodologies in terms of tracking this, these new sectors, new players, new industries. So it's very much possible. So please do reach out if you are in a situation of that kind.
Yeah. So there's a couple of questions for me. Of course, what we do basically, there's a question that how we can keep sharing this insightful information with the audience. So what we do, and DNB, we have periodic webinars. There is a white paper. There are reports which being published and being put up on our website. After this one, I would send across those link of our website. Please visit that, and you'll be able to see all those publication which we publish at a regular level. And at a webinar level, our team will reach out to the larger audience in terms of invitation, what the insight we're doing, and intention is that to and keep sharing such a wonderful insight every month, so as at least we keep our audience client ahead of the curve in terms of what's developed. And so it's available, and one can go and subscribe and have a look at it. So there's one question's coming in for you, Alok, and since you've touched base in terms of how, in terms of the data collection. So if I were to collect leads of newly registered businesses, what is the value addition of using DNB, using data from DNB as opposed to collecting data directly from the ministry? So what is data, basically the raw data from the ministry, or value addition DNB bring on the table for them?
So as I mentioned earlier, one of the aspects that we do is that my data point or the base starts from, these kind of registry information that we get, to get to know that, yeah, there is a company like this which is in existence. On top of it, we then try to see the digital footprint of the company. We also try to have access to certain information in terms of trying to understand the pedigree of the key management promoters who are there, as well as trying to ascertain how the shareholding structure is, so on and so forth. So you get to know a lot of information on these businesses which are there. In addition to that, we also try and access information wherein we can get to know about the digital aspects, about how they're making the payments of the taxes, so on and so forth. And as Avinash talked about, the digital footprint that we have in terms of concept-based information, that's the kind of capability that we have been building. So that's how we could benefit in terms of using leveraging on the database. The other aspect I would say is that when we talk about our building of database, we are proud of the fact that we follow very stringent governance process before we identify any source or before the information is actually ingested in the database. So when you access the data, you can be completely assured and confident that the data that you use is fully compliant, not only in terms of usage, but also in terms of taking the decisions.
Right. So there's one more questions coming in, especially for the DRS, Alok. I mean, we can take it, in terms of what is the process of registration with Dun & Bradstreet for MSMEs? So you want to take on that, Alok?
Yeah, sure. So with regards to registration process for MSME within the database, we have got a product and a solution around the CBIG business. wherein there are multiple customers across India who actually come and register on our database. One of the key benefits by registering on our database is that in one of the slides, I talked about there are 250,000 customers, 250,000 customers who continuously are looking into our database through multiple channels, through multiple solutions. Now, the moment you form part of our database, you have customers who are looking for it, and the potential for you to engage with them actually goes higher the moment you form part of the DNB ecosystem. So as a solution around it, we have got CBIC as a solution, as well as we have recently launched about a year back a solution around DUNS registered seal, wherein we actually provide you a DRS seal which you can use in your signatures. You can put it on your website portal to ensure the authenticity of an entity or a business being established or is in present. One of the reasons why customers essentially come to us is when you go and approach that customer, I'm sure you're going to give a very, very good picture about yourself. You are actually going to say that, yeah, this is the business we are into. This is the kind of financial stability that we have. But the moment you have a stamp from Dun & Bradstreet side, it authenticates what you are saying, whether that's true or not. And that's the reason customers come to us in terms of providing, registering with us, and forming part of our database.
So thank you, Alok, for that. There are many questions, but I'm conscious about the time, so I will just take up last two questions. And one question is basically for you, Avinash, is coming in that how do you expect the operating model of businesses to evolve in the near future? Will businesses permanently transition to work from anywhere model, or will come back to what it used to be earlier?
Sure. So I think that's a very open debate, I guess. We are having it in our own internal setup, and I'm sure every other large company is also having it. I think what is given is that, I think the flexibility, some elements of the flexibility will have to be built in any operating model. So will it be all work from office? No. Will it be all work from home? No. I think the advantages to work from office, especially for the younger people who are starting out, with the relationships you build, the closeness to action you have, and there's been a lot of work. If you read some of the management journals, some of the financial press, there's a lot of commentary on how, I guess, persuasion is going to be better than kind of enforcing a set of rules around it. So I think it's going to be hybrid. The biggest challenge, I think, for all of us who live in large cities and have to go commute to work, the commute is the problem. The time of commute, the quality of the commute, time, I guess one can, still rationalize, but the quality of the commute, be it, in today's world, as we talked about with social distancing, the lack of ventilation, all of that is a challenge for a large part of the workforce. So I think, they will have to be solutioning around, maybe very flexible hours, reduce the pressures on the commute. But I think working from office will remain very large, attractive part, I think, for all of us. Because in teams, in interactions is what, and I guess we are all human beings for a reason, that, we will be part of that. And especially for large companies to build ecosystems with clients, ecosystems where a large number of team members can interact with the same client, large number of team members can interact among themselves. There are huge advantages in that, and that maybe might take another generation or two to change. But so I think it'll be a very easy hybrid, if I can put it this way.
Thank you, Avinash. Last final question, and that question for you, Alok. I think you touched base in your presentation, but it's coming in this. How you help in terms of monitoring the compliance of one's vendor or customer, basically the compliance check. Is there any DNB helping in terms of getting some sort of real-time flag, real-time signals? How that look like? So there's one question for that side.
Great question. So just to share with you, especially around this compliance bit, I would just want to share a data point. So within DNB database, we have got 1.4 million companies, which is 14 lakh companies, where we have got red flags or some kind of a signal on the other on those businesses. And this, a lot of our customers are leveraging significantly when they're actually going about in terms of onboarding, or probably onboarding them either as a supplier or probably evaluating them from a customer standpoint. This is not only at the time of onboarding, but they also want to make sure that on a quarterly basis or probably on a yearly basis, they have these checks undertaken on these businesses. There are about 60 odd sources that we check, especially on the compliance side. And the updates happen from a daily basis to once every quarter. Like just to give an example, the NCLT checks that we do, it happens every day. The EPF checks, the checks on the GST, they happen on a monthly basis. We're able to provide those kind of information in terms of how compliant those businesses are. When we talk about defaulters information, again, they are updated every month or every quarter, depending on when we get the information. Now, when these information are made available, we try to just not track that particular entity, but also the related entities as well. How as a group, how these particular businesses or entities are. And then we come out with certain predictive insights in terms of providing a red flag on those businesses or those individuals. And these are the kind of real-time updates that can be made available to the customers.
Thank you, Alok, for such a wonderful insight, and thank you, Avinash, for sharing wonderful perspective. I know we timed out with 17-minute, after the schedule, so there are many questions. What I'll do, we'll write back to those audience, and we'll come back. And with that, thank you for joining, and we'll close today's webinar. And thank you, and look forward for more engageful and insightful webinar in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everybody. Bye. Have a lovely day.
Thanks, Costa.
Thank you, everyone.